Page 475. Their lonely prison struggle had been essentially undertaken for all of us, for all future prisoners, even though they themselves might not think so, nor understand this, for how we would exist in imprisonment and how we would be kept there. And if they had won out, then probably nothing of what happened to us would have happened, nothing of what this book is about, all 7 of its parts. But they were beaten. They failed to protect either themselves or us. In part too, the canopy of loneliness is spread over them because in the very first post-revolutionary years, having naturally accepted from the GPU the well-merited identification of politicals, they naturally agreed with the GPU that all who were to the right of them, beginning with the cadets, were not politicals but counter-revolutionaries, the manure of history. And they also regarded as counter-revolutionaries those who suffered for their faith in Christ, and whoever didn't know what right or left meant, and that in the future would be all of us, they considered to be counter-revolutionaries also. And thus it was that, in part voluntarily, in part involuntarily, keeping themselves aloof of shunning others, they gave their blessing to the future 58, into whose maw they themselves would disappear. Objects and actions change their aspect quite decisively depending on the position of the observer. In this chapter, we have been describing the present stand of the socialists from their point of view, and you see, it is illuminated by pure and tragic light. But those counter-revolutionaries whom the politicals treated so contemptuously on Solovki, those counter-revolutionaries recall the politicals in their own way. The politicals, what a nasty crowd they were. They looked down their noses at everyone else. They stuck their own group. They demanded their own special rations all the time, and their own special privileges. And they kept quarreling among themselves incessantly. And how can one but feel that there is truth here too? All those fruitless and endless arguments which by now were merely comical, and those demands for additional rations for themselves in comparison with the masses of the hungry and impoverished. In the Soviet period, the honorable appellation of politicals turned out to be a poisoned gift, and then another reproach followed immediately. Why was it that the socialists, who used to escape so easily under the Tsar, had become so soft in Soviet prisons? Where are their escapes? In general, there were quite a few escapes, but no one can remember any socialists among them. And in turn, those prisoners to the left of the socialists, the Trotskyites and the communists, shunned the socialists, considering them exactly the same as the counter-revolutionaries, same kind of counter-revolutionaries as the rest, and they closed the moat of isolation around them with an encircling ring. The Trotskyites and the communists, each considering their own direction more pure and lofty than all the rest, despised and even hated the socialists and each other, who were imprisoned behind the bars of the same buildings and went outdoors to walk in the same prison courtyards. Ekaterina Orlitskaya recalled that in 1937, at the transit prison in Veneno Bay, when the socialists called to each other across the fence between the men's and women's compounds, looking for fellow socialists and reporting news, the communists Luisa Kotik and Maria Krudikova were indignant because they might bring down punishment on them all by such irresponsible behavior. They said, all our misfortunes are due to those socialist rats. A profound explanation, and so dialectical too. They should be choked. And those two girls in Lubyanka in 1925, for whom I have already mentioned, sang about spring and lilacs only because one of them was a socialist revolutionary and the second a member of the communist opposition, and they had no political song in common. In fact, the communist deviationist girl shouldn't really have joined the socialist revolutionary girl in her protest at all. And if in a Tsarist prison the different parties often joined forces in a common struggle, let us recall this connection. In this connection, the escape from the Sevastopol Central Prison. In Soviet prisons, each political group tried to ensure its own purity by steering clear of others. The Trotskyites struggled on their own. Apart from the socialists and communists, the communists didn't struggle at all. For how could one allow oneself to struggle against one's own government and one's own prison? In turn, it turned out, in consequence, that the communists and isolators and imprisoned for long-termers were restricted earlier and more cruelly than others. In 1928, in the Yaroslavl Central Prison, the communist Nadezhda Surovtseva went outdoors for fresh air. In a single file column that was forbidden to engage in conversation, while the socialists were still chattering in their own groups. She was not permitted to tend the flowers in the courtyard because they had been left by previous prisoners who had struggled for their rights, and they deprived her of newspapers too. However, the secret political department of the GBU permitted her to have complete sets of Marx and Engels, Lenin and Hegel in her cell. Her mother's visit to her took place virtually in the dark, and her downcast mother died soon afterward. What must she have thought of her daughter's circumstances in prison? The difference between the treatment of socialist prisoners and that of the communists persisted many years, went far beyond this and extended to a difference in rewards. In 1937-38, the socialists were imprisoned like the rest, and they all got their tenors too. But as a rule, they were not forced to denounce themselves. They had, after all, never hidden their own special individual views, which were quite enough to get them sentenced. But a communist had no special individual views. So what, then, was he to be sentenced for if a self-denunciation wasn't forced out of him? Even though the enormous archipelago was already spreading across the land, the prisons for long-termers didn't fall into decay. The old jail tradition was being zealously carried on. Everything new and invaluable which the archipelago had contributed to the indoctrination of the masses was still not enough in itself. The deficiency was provided for by the complementary existence of the towns, the special purpose prisons, and prisons for long-termers in general. Not everyone swallowed up by the great machine was allowed to mingle with natives of the archipelago. Well-known foreigners, individuals who were too famous or who were being held secretly, purged Gabitsty, Secret Service police, could not by any means be seen openly in camp. Their hauling a barrel did not compensate for their disclosure and the consequent moral political damage. In the same way, the socialists who were engaged in a continuous struggle for their prison rights could not conceivably be permitted to mingle with the masses, but had to be kept separately, and in fact suffocated separately, in view of their special privileges and rights. Much later on in the 50s, as we shall learn later in this work, the special purpose prisons were also needed to isolate camp rebels, and in the last years of his life, disappointed in the possibilities of reforming thieves, Stalin gave orders that various ringleaders of the thieves should also get Tyurzak rather than camp. And then, to be sure, it was necessary for the state to support free of charge in prison those prisoners who, because of their feebleness, would have immediately died off in camp and would thus have shirked their duty to serve out their terms, and others who couldn't possibly be used in camp work, like the blind Kopeikin, a man of 70 who used to sit all day long in the market in Yuryevets on the Volga. His songs and facetious comments won him 10 years for KRD, counter-revolutionary activity. But in this case, they had to substitute prison for camp. The inventory of old jails inherited from the Romanov dynasty was, of necessity, looked after, remodeled, strengthened, and perfected. Certain central prisons, like the one in Yaroslavl, were so well and suitably appointed, doors plated with iron, table, stool, and cot permanently anchored in each cell, that the only thing required to bring them up to date was the installation of muzzles on the windows and the fencing in of the courtyards, where the prisoners walked in order to reduce them to the size of a cell. By 1937, all the trees on prison grounds had been cut down, all vegetable gardens plowed under, and all grassy areas paved with asphalt. Others, like the one in Sustal, required new equipment, and the monastery arrangement had to be remodeled. But after all, self-incarceration of a body in a monastery and its incarceration in a prison by the state serve physically similar purposes, and therefore the buildings were always easy to adapt. One of the buildings of the Sukhanovka monastery was adapted for use as a prison for long-termers. Of course, it was also necessary to make up for losses from the Tsarist inventory. The conversion of Peter and Paul Fortress in Leningrad and of Schusselburg near Leningrad into museums for tourists. The Vladimir Central Prison was expanded and added to with a big new building constructed under Yezhov. It was heavily used and garnered many prisoners over the decades. We have already mentioned how the Tobolsk Central Prison was inaugurated, and that Verkhnya Uralsk was opened in 1925 for continuous and abundant use. To our misfortune, all these isolators are still in use and are in operation at the moment these lines are being written. From Tvardovsky poem, Distance Beyond Distance, one can draw the conclusion that the Alexandrovsk Central Prison wasn't empty in Stalin's time either. We have less information about the one in Orel. It is feared that it suffered serious damage during World War II, but not far from it was the well-equipped prison for long-termers in Dmitrovsk, Orlovsky. During the 20s, the prisoners' food was very decent in the isolators for prisons, still called Tyurzak Rikti, political lockups, by the prisoners. The lunches always included some meat. Fresh vegetables were served. Milk could be bought in the commissary. In 1931-33, the food deteriorated sharply, but things were no better out in freedom at the time. Both scurvy and dizziness from lack of food were no rarity in the prisons for politicals in those years. Later on, the food improved, but it was never the same as before. In 1947, in the Vladimir Ton, I. Kornaev was constantly hungry. 1 pound of bread, 2 pieces of sugar, 2 hot dishes, which were not at all filling. The only thing available in unlimited quantities was boiling water. It will, of course, be said that once more that this was not a typical year, and there was hunger outside and freedom too at the time. This was when they generously allowed freedom to feed prison. Unlimited parcels were permitted. The light in cells was always rationed, so to speak. In both the 30s and the 40s, the muzzles on the windows and the frosted reinforced glass created permanent twilight in the cells. Darkness is an important factor in causing depression. They often stretched netting above the window muzzle, and in the winter it was covered with snow, which cut off this last access to light. Reading became no more than a way of ruining one's eyes. In the Vladimir ton, they made up for this lack of light at night. Bright electric lights burned all night long, preventing sleep. And in the Dmitrovsk prison in 1938, Kozyrev, there was a light in the evenings and at night, a kerosene lamp on a little shelf way up near the ceiling that burned away and smoked up the last air. In 1939, there were electric lights that glowed red at half voltage. Air was rationed too. The hinged panes for ventilation were kept locked and opened only during the interval of the prisoner's trip to the toilet, as prisoners were called from both Dmitrovsk and Yaroslavl prisons. Why Ginsburg? The bread grew moldy between morning and lunchtime. Sheets were damp and the walls green. In Vladimir in 1948, there was no lack of air because the transom was open permanently. Walks outdoors ranged from 15 to 45 minutes at various hours in various prisons. There was no such thing as communication with the soil that had existed in Shusselburg or Solovki. Everything that grew had been torn up by the roots, trampled, covered with concrete and asphalt. They even forbade lifting one's head up to the heavens during the walks. Look at your feet. This was the command of Kozyrev and Adamova. Remember from the Kazan prison. Visits from relatives were forbidden in 1937 and never renewed. Letters could be sent to close relatives twice a month and could be received from them in most years. But in Kazan, they had to be returned to the administration the day after they had been read. Access to the commissary to make purposes with the money sent in specifically limited amounts was usually permitted. Furniture was no unimportant part of the prison regimen. Adamova wrote eloquently of her happiness at finding a simple wooden cot with a straw mattress and a simple wooden table in her cell in Sustal, after having had only cots that folded into the wall and chairs anchored to the floor. In the Vladimir ton, Korneyev experienced two different prison regimens. Under one in 1947-48, personal articles were not removed from the cell. One could lie down during the day, and the turnkey very seldom looked through the peephole. But under the other, in 53, the cell was locked with two locks, the responsibility of the turnkey and duty officer respectively. One was forbidden to lie down, forbidden to talk in a normal voice, in Kazan only in a whisper. Personal articles were all taken away, and uniform of striped mattresses. Ticking was issued. Correspondence was permitted only twice a year, and only on those days announced without warning by the chief of the prison. Anyone who missed that day couldn't write, and only a sheet of paper half the size of a postal sheet could be used. Violent searches and unscheduled visits were frequent, requiring the complete turning out of one's belongings and undressing down to one's skin. Communication between cells was prohibited to such an extent that the jailers went through the toilets with a portable lantern after each toilet visit. and searched in each hole. The entire cell would get punishment cells for graffiti in the toilets. The punishment cells were a scourge in the special purpose prisons. One could get into a punishment cell for coughing. Cover your head with your blanket, then you can cough. Or for walking around the cell, Kozyrev. It was considered to be rebellious for the noise made by one's shoes. In the Kazan prison, women had been issued men's shoes that were much too large for women's feet, size 10.5. Incidentally, Ginsburg was correct in concluding that periods in a punishment cell were meted out not for any particular misdemeanor, but according to a schedule. Every prisoner was required to spend some time there in order to learn what it was like, and the rules included another generally applicable point. In the event of any display of unruliness in a punishment cell, the chief of the prison has right to extend the term of incarceration to 20 days. In there. Just what was meant by unruliness. Here's what happened to Kozyrev. The description of the punishment cell is much else in the prison regimentally to such an extent among all sources that the stamp of a single system of administrative rules can be detected. He was given another 5 days in the punishment cell for pacing back and forth. In the autumn, the building containing the punishment cell was unheated, and it was very cold. The forced prisoners to undress down to their underwear and to take off their shoes. The floor was bare, earth and dust. It might be wet dirt, and in the Kazan prison it might even be covered with water. Kozyrev had a stool of his. Ginsburg had none in hers. He immediately concluded that he would perish, that he would freeze to death, but some kind of mysterious inner warmth gradually made itself felt, and it was his salvation. He learned to sleep sitting on his stool. They gave him a mug of hot water 3 times a day, and it made him drunk. One of the duty officers, in violation of the rules, pressed a piece of sugar into his 10.5-ounce bread ration. On the basis of the rations issued him, and by observing the light from some faraway, tiny labyrinthine window, Kozyrev kept count of the days. His 5 days had come to an end, but he had not been released. His sense of hearing had become extremely acute, and he heard whispers in the corridor, having to do with either the 6th or 6 days. This was a provocation. They were waiting for him to say that his 5 days were over and that it was time to let him out. That would have constituted unruliness, for which the stay in his punishment cell would have been prolonged. But he sat silent and obedient for another day, and then they let him out, just as if everything had been the way it was supposed to be. Perhaps the chief of the prison used this method for testing all the prisoners in turn for submissiveness, and then he could sentence all those who weren't yet submissive enough to further terms in the punishment cell. After the punishment cell, the ordinary cell seemed like a palace. Kozyrev became deaf for half a year, and he began to get abscesses in his throat. His cellmate went insane from frequent imprisonment in the punishment cell, and Kozyrev was kept locked up with an insane man for more than a year, just the 2 of them in there. Nadezhda Surovtseva recalls many cases of insanity and political isolators. She herself recalls as many as Novorusky totaled up in the whole chronicle of Schuselberg. Does it not at this point seem to the reader that we have gradually, step by step, mounted to the very point, the peak of the second horn, and that it's probably really higher than the first, and probably sharper too. But opinions are divided. With one voice, the old camp veterans consider the Vladimir Ton of the 50s a resort. That is how Vladimir Borisovich Feldovich, sent there from Abad Station, regarded it, and Anna Petrovna Skripnikova, who was there sent there in 1956 from the Kamarava camps. Skripnikova was particularly astonished at the regular dispatch every 10 days of petitions and declarations. She even began to write, believe it or not, to the United Nations. And by the excellent library, including books in foreign languages, I used to bring a complete catalog to the cell, and you made out a list for a whole year ahead. It is also necessary to keep in mind how elastic our law is. Thousands of women, wives, were sent to prison, to Tyurzak, and then one fine day someone whistled, and they were transferred to camps. The Kolama hadn't fulfilled the gold plan, and so they switched them, without any trial or any court. In fact, does Tyurzak actually exist at all, or is it only the vestibule for the camps? And only here, right here, is where our chapter ought to have begun. It ought to have examined that glimmering light which, in time, the soul of the lonely prisoner begins to emit like a halo of a saint. Torn from the hustle-bustle of everyday life in so absolute a degree that even counting the passing minutes puts him intimately in touch with the universe, the lonely prisoner has to have been purged of every imperfection, of everything that has stirred and troubled him in his former life, that has prevented his muddied waters from settling into transparency. How gratefully his fingers reached out to feel the crumbs, to feel and crumble the lumps of earth in the vegetable garden. But alas, it is all asphalt. How his head rises of itself toward the eternal heavens. But alas, this is forbidden. And how much touching attention the little bird on the windowsill arouses him. But alas, there is that muzzle there, and the netting as well, and the hinged ventilation pane is locked. And what clear thoughts, what sometimes surprising conclusion he writes down on the paper issued to him. But alas, only if you buy it in the commissary, and only if you turn it into the prison office when you have used it up for eternal safekeeping. But our peevish qualifications somehow interrupt our line of thought. The plan of our chapter creaks and cracks, and we no longer know the answer to the question, is the soul of a person in the new type prison, in the special purpose prison, the Tan, purified, or does it perish once and for all? If the first thing you see each and every morning is the eyes of your cellmate who has gone insane, how then shall you save yourself during the coming day? Nikolai Alexandrovich Kozyrev, whose brilliant career in astronomy was interrupted by his arrest, saved himself only by thinking of the eternal and infinite, of the order of the universe, and of its supreme spirit of the stars, of their internal state, of what time and the passing of time really are. And in this way he began to discover a new field in physics, and only in this way did he succeed in surviving in the Dmitrovsk prison. But his line of mental exploration was blocked by forgotten figures. He could not build any further. He had to have a lot of figures. Now, just where could he get them in his solitary confinement cell, with its overnight kerosene lamp, a cell into which not even a little bird could enter? And the scientist prayed, "Please God, I have done everything I could. Please help me continue." At this time, he was entitled to receive one book every 10 days. By then, he was alone in the cell. In the meager prison library were several different editions of Demian Bedny's Red Concert, which kept coming around to each cell again and again. Half an hour passed after his prayer. It came to exchange his book, and as usual, without asking anything at all, they pushed a book at him. It was entitled A Course in Astrophysics. Where had it come from? He simply could not imagine such a book in a prison library. Aware of the brief duration of this coincidence, Kosarev threw himself on it and began to memorize everything he needed immediately, and everything he might need later on. In all, just 2 days had passed, and he had 8 days left in which to keep his book, when there was an unscheduled inspection by the chief of the prison. His eagle eye noticed immediately, "But you are an astronomer." "Yes, take this book away from him." But its mystical arrival had opened the way for his further work, which he then continued in the camp of Norilsk. And so now we should begin the chapter on the conflict between the soul and the bars. But what is this? The jailer's key is rattling brazenly in the lock. The gloomy block superintendent is there with a long list. Last name, first name, patronymic, date of birth, article of code, term, end of term. Get your things together. Be quick about it. Well, brothers, a prisoner transport. We're off to somewhere. Good Lord, bless us. Shall we gather up our bones? Well, here's what. If we are still alive, then we'll finish this story another time, in part 4, if we are still alive. That's the end of part 1. I'm so excited to start part 2 with everyone. I hope people will continue to listen, because it really does get so much more just enthralling. Please keep listening. We'll start part 2 soon. Thank you.